Hello, Chubby and Coos fans. It's me, Candace, back for another author event. As always, I am super excited about tonight's event because we have a sci-fi veteran with us today who has been in the industry for a really long time. And so I'm so excited to talk to him. So today I am talking with Tom Purdom, who has been in this industry and writing science fiction for more than 60 years, I think. So we're talking today just about science fiction in general and his groundbreaking novel from 1964, I Want the Stars. This novel pioneered queer themes and featured one of the first protagonists of color in science fiction, which is really, really cool. It was a bona fide hit. It sold like 70,000 copies. And since then, Tom has written a lot of things. He was nominated for a Hugo Award in 2000, and he continues to be regularly published in magazines like Asimov's and Fantasy and Science Fiction. And he's been just a pillar of the sci-fi community for a really long time. So I'm really excited to have him here with us today. And I also am bringing on Gideon Marcus, who I've talked to before. And Gideon is a lot of things as well. A professional space historian. He's an award-winning science fiction author. He's a presenter. He's a publisher. So Gideon does a lot of different things as well. He actually runs the publisher Journey Press that publishes Tom's book that is like bringing it back into the world. And he edits a lot of stuff, and he runs Galactic Journey, which is another really cool thing. And so Gideon is going to come on and sort of tell us about how it came about, how he discovered Tom's book, and how it came about that he's republishing this book from 1964. So welcome, Tom and Gideon. I'm so excited to have y'all here.
And I'm glad to be here.
And Gideon, so why don't you tell us the story of how this book, how you just rediscovered it and how it came about that you're republishing it?
So I run Galactic Journey, which is basically a bunch of nerds living 55 years ago, day by day, and writing about science fiction of the time. So we read everything that comes out, all the magazines, all the books. And I have a big Ace Double collection. Back in the day, Ace Doubles were like comic books for science fiction in terms of, well, I don't mean in terms of quality, but just ubiquity. You could always find an Ace paperback somewhere. And they were two books back to back on each other's spine. And so there you go. That's it. So 1964 or 2008, 2019, the book I happened to be reading was Tom's, and I was just blown away because Ted Sturgeon said 90% of everything is crap, and he was right. And even the good stuff of back then still sort of carries the stamp of its time. What was amazing about Tom's book was not only was it quite a good book, but it's timeless. There is a way to write science fiction where it doesn't have the trappings of the day it's in. David Brin is very good at that too. And Tom just wrote this book that could have been published today. In fact, I think it was Alistair Stewart who just did a review where he said that this book doesn't feel dated at all. And he approaches, I love the idea that Earth is a utopia and there's not some sort of, sting in its tail. We really have a utopia. Now what do we do? And the fact that Tom could explore these themes and also have a rip-roaring adventure and, aliens from another galaxy, all within 140 pages is just astonishing and goes with what Algis Budger says, which is you don't need 700 pages to make an epic, Frank Herbert. So anyway, I love this book so much, and I'm always looking to republish great stuff. And I happened to cast about, and I think I just asked Tom if he had any thoughts on the book. And then it just sort of, we have a slot. Would you like us to republish it? And so we got a good cover for it, and he said yes, and it's been fantastic. And it's been actually starting to sell like gangbusters the last couple of months, now that we're finally at the end of the pandemic tunnel.
Awesome. And Tom, how does it feel to have your book republished after so long?
Well, it's just one of those things that happens to writers and you never think of it, And I don't really know how to explain it. It just, yeah, well, it's a very nice thing to have happen. Let's put it that way. That's the best way to put it. It's a very nice thing to have happen. And, you know, I wrote it as an, do you want me to talk about ace doubles and things?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, yeah. Yes,
Well,
yes.
as I held the book up, as you can see, there were 2 books bound. This is the original of I Want the Stars. I don't know how well you can see it. There, I should do it. And then if you flip it over, you get Demon's World by Kenneth Fulmer, another novel. And this was a format that, as Gideon said, was just all over the place. And it was a great market for beginners. I think that's very important. Ace went in for space opera, which basically would be the Star Wars type of thing, you know, interstellar adventure, action in a nice, colorful future. And what the most, well, first of all, you had writers who were fairly high volume producers for Ace. You could make a living if you did like 4 novels a month or a year or so. And then you also occasionally had writers who were real stars, like Paul Anderson or Fred Pohl. They might do a book that didn't sell to a you know, a more prestigious publisher, and so it might appear as Ace. And then it was a great beginners market. Ursula K. Le Guin wrote 3 ace doubles before she wrote the Left Hand of Darkness, which became the book that established her. That was an ace single. And Chip Delaney, Samuel R. Delaney, became a big name writing ace books. In fact, my second ace double, I Want the Tree Lord of Evatan, which came out in 1966, has one of Chip's book, Empire Stars, on the back.
We just reviewed Empire Star last month, and the review of your book is actually going to be coming up in a couple of days. I have not read it, so I hope it's good. Did you like it?
I haven't read the review. Each of these books was seen as as I said, to some extent, it's a beginner's exercise in which I did my best. So, the Tree Lord of Evatan is a sword and planet story. You know, lots of action with humans put down on a primitive world and so on. And if you like that kind of thing, apparently lots of people have. So it's a, you know, and I will not make any more comments on that. What was I going to say? Anyway, it was a good beginner's line. And in 1963, I had been selling science fiction since *57, the magazine Les, but I was still trying to sell my first novel. And in those days, when you sold a novel by writing a presentation, 3 sample chapters and an outline, and then I had an agent. My agent would, you know, if you got a contract on that, you got half the advance on signing and the other half when you turned in an acceptable manuscript. Well, I had written about 4 presentations that my agent was willing to market, but none of them had sold. And so I decided that maybe I was a little too ambitious and I should step back and aim at the ace double market and write a space opera, you know. And so what I picked as a subject, the basic overall subject, was the humans exploring a mysterious planet. And then when you get ideas like that, there's a thing I learned from reading an article by a mystery writer. All mysteries have the same basic plot situation. So what he does is he'd ask himself questions. Who's the detective? Who got murdered? You know, and come up with the most interesting answers he could. So that's what I did. And it was a funny thing because my wife we'd been married a couple of years. She was visiting her mother. And so I had this loose evening. And I went to this coffee house that we went to in those days. And somehow there was nobody there I knew, which was very unusual. And so I took the yellow paper, the yellow menus, had these big long yellow menus, and flipped one over and started plotting the book on the back. It was a real experience because in 20 minutes I plotted the book, which really surprised me. 20 minutes, very intense, and I've often wished I could do that again. But
20 minutes?
What's that?
Oh, I was just like 20 minutes. That's like nuts to me that you plotted it in 20 minutes.
I know. Well, it is to me too. But I got the basic idea. I got the opening scene. I knew how it was going to end. I had and then it took me about 6 weeks to write the sample 3 chapters and outline, as I remember it. But one thing was, is I knew this had to be a colorful action adventure book, Interstellar. That was fine. But I was determined that I was not going to use a standard cookie cutter off the shelf background like a galactic empire or an interstellar federation. And so I decided that my interstellar explorers would come from a very advanced human society of about 400 years in the future, and that I would make it the very society I would most like to live in. So it's my personal utopia. And it's basically a society, there's no war, people have long lifespans, and so you can spend 50 years learning how to be a human being, and thus you learn it's not a good idea to devote too much time to violence. And nobody has to work. The machines do all the work, and the society is so rich that if you want to travel the galaxy, you can just ask for a faster than light starship, and they give you one. And as for the motivations of my explorers, they're just traveling the galaxy because that's what they'd like to do. You just like to travel to Europe or something. And at that time, we were beginning to realize that life could be very common in the universe. And so there's lots and lots of alien species that they can visit. And then they come to this mysterious planet, and that's where the plot begins. But what I found was I have I've received at least one very long letter over the years from a reader who said he read this book when he was 14, and it was the book that turned him on to science fiction, which I think is wonderful. And what he liked about it was this picture of the future and of these people just able to travel the galaxy just because they wanted to,
Yeah, and I love that it is a utopia, right? Because we don't see a lot of, when you think of science fiction, a lot of people think dystopia, right? Like
right.
That's most of what we get is like super depressing stuff, or like space opera or something. We rarely get utopia in science fiction. So I love that.
Yeah, I've always said science fiction has a built-in pessimism because it's fiction, and to have fiction, you have to have conflicts and plots. And so you name almost any development, that might take place in the future, and the science fiction writers will immediately begin to think of what's going to go wrong. And that's where the stories are. And I've tended to fight this all my life in writing. I think, it's harder though. It's easy to see some development will create technological unemployment, but it's much harder to imagine the jobs that will replace the jobs that are being destroyed. We've been doing that for 300 years. We've been replacing jobs steadily, new things. The people who lived 1700 could not have imagined, computer software architects or video game designers or professional video game players. And none of that could have been, And for me to sit down now and say, what will people do for a living 100 years from now? That is a real challenge and very difficult. And it's much easier to think, they'll all be living on the dole or something,
Yeah, for sure. And that's one thing that I wanted to talk to you about is your vision of the future. Because I assume it has changed a bit since you wrote this book in 1950 or 64 is when it came out. I don't know when you wrote it.
I wrote 63.
Okay, 63. So how has your vision of the future changed or evolved since you wrote this book? Or has it? Maybe it hasn't, but I would assume it has in some way.
Well, if you're talking about my vision of a desirable future, I don't think it's changed that much. No, my vision of a desirable future is one in which people can pretty much do whatever they want. And they can, and you can trust them not to do not to do destructive things or violent things or so on. That to me is what you want, right? We'd all like to be able to live our lives the way we want. Essentially, I'm an anarchist. And the idea is, of course, that you can do this at a certain point because the people themselves have evolved. That's very important in their attitudes and so on. And so they can be trusted with all this power. Now, the question is, if you want a question of how my ideas have evolved about what the future will be like, I still think that the kind of future I'm talking about is possible. All right, you shouldn't write it off, but there's a lot of there's two ideas I keep in mind. So thinking about what the real future will be like. One is from Arthur Clarke. Clarke was one of the most optimistic visionaries of the 20th century, and yet he once said that we might be just smart enough to get into trouble and not smart enough to get out of it. And there are people who said that may be why we don't see any other civilizations out there, because they get to where our stage and a little beyond, and they can't control the side effects of the powers they have, that we've acquired now, and they end up destroying themselves. So that is a real possibility and a danger, and it's up to us. The other one comes from a writer named Lester Del Rey. Certain Gideon is familiar with Lester Del Rey from that period. Back in the 1970s, I think it was, when the Cold War was at its height, I had a conversation with Lester, and he pointed out that after World War II, because of the atomic bomb, there are all these stories that, of course, were about the future dominated by the atomic bomb. He said you only saw two possibilities: either all-out nuclear war destroying civilization, or world government. And he said nobody had foreseen what we were living through, the balance of terror, the nuclear stalemate. And what Lester said was, human beings will make the minimum adjustment necessary to survive. And that's something that a lot of people find pessimistic. I can remember when people like John F. Kennedy and so on would say things like mankind must abolish war, or war will abolish mankind. But a lot of people feel, right, it should be one or the other. And the idea that we might go right on fighting wars and making minimum, which we're doing, and yet avoiding nuclear war. And so I will tell you that if you really want to imagine what the future will be like, what you can say is that if we survive, we will probably make the minimum adjustment necessary to do it, which means a lot of people will not be happy. But I think that's the, and in a way that means that we're a cautious species, and that's a good thing too.
Just wanted to point out that one of the central tenets of I Want the Stars is every species goes through its problems as it's maturing, but to leave the planet, it has to have a certain maturity, and that's why there are no wars in this universe of I Want the Stars. And that's why there's one rapacious race, and why it stands out as unique from all the others, because all the other races in the galaxy are mature, having gone through that adolescent period before they left the planet. It sounds to me like you would not subscribe to that theory in a modern novel.
I might still, because don't forget, science fiction is about the possibilities. And if the challenge is so great that to survive, we have to really make that leap, then I think we will make that leap. But only if we absolutely have to. And we really feel threatened to the point where we know we have to. Have you read Stars My Destination?
I have not. But
is it all right if I give away the ending a little?
Sure, go ahead.
It's a magnificent ending. The Stars My Destination. The basic idea is about that it's possible for people to transport. It's called jumping, teleporting, and that's what the basic idea is. But one of the things that runs through it, there's been this substance discovered called pyrene, P-I-R-E, and it is being kept away, hidden, because it just to look at it, you can set off a tremendous explosion. It's that kind of power. Anyway, it's just this awesome explosive power which anybody can use if it's. And in the end, the hero Gully Foyle, who has been challenged and withdrawn. As you may remember, he goes jumping around the world. It's a tremendous ending, and he throws the pyre to the crowds, and he says to them basically, grow or die. And it's a magnificent ending. It is. And that may happen to us. Maybe it's happening to us now,
Yeah, that's you're making me think a lot, which is awesome.
Well, that's what science fiction does. I've been reading it since 1950, and you get all this stuff in your head, and yeah.
For sure. I mean, that's why I guess it's interesting to me too how the way we talk about science fiction has changed throughout the years, because it was science fiction and then it sort of evolved and got to speculative fiction, which it's still sort of called that. And, but now we're sort of back to science fiction. And I think that's really interesting because it went through this period because genre has always sort of been looked down upon by other people, that it's like, oh, let's change this to speculative fiction so that it's not as. So how do you feel about that? You've seen this whole evolution of sci-fi.
I think that science fiction is still looked down upon.
Oh, it is.
That's why people, speculative fiction is used to combine science fiction and fantasy by a lot of people, which I don't think makes sense, because speculation means to me, you're saying, well, what would happen if? And I don't think fantasy really springs from that. It's just more like, you create adventures and it's, from fantasy premises. But with the science fiction, there is that sense that the readers really are interested in where the world is going and what we're going to do with things like space colonization and so on. And I don't think it's that. It's always been one of the less popular genres, and I think it still is to some extent, even though it's widely distributed and widely read. Let's see, what was the question again?
Oh, we're just talking there. It was mainly just about the sort of the evolution of sci-fi, Well,
I think the biggest evolution has been literary. Definitely, if you go back to the 30s and compare that to the fiction of the 50s was better written than the 30s, and you see writers experimenting more with literary techniques, some of which work and some don't. But yeah, it's definitely more literarily sophisticated. But I see that often the same themes continue, and that science fiction is kind of a long-term conversation. For example, you hear a lot now about the posthuman future. That's one of the terms. Back in the 60s, when Frederick Pohl was editing the Galaxy magazines, I once heard him say that he felt science fiction had been through 3 stages. In the first stage, science fiction writers realized that technology was going to change. The second stage, they realized society was going to change. And then in the third stage, they realized people were going to change. And Fred then in the 1960s said, and now we're writing about people who are no longer quite human. And I think that tendency that theme continues. There's an anthology which Gardner Dozois, who was one of the big anthologists and editors who died just a couple of years ago. Anyway, Gardner I think it was 1999. He did an anthology called Supermen: Tales of the Posthuman Future. And that's what it's all about. It's all about people who've been enhanced in various ways. And when I read it, I'm in it with my story that was nominated for Hugo, the Fossil Games. And whenever I'm in an anthology, I kind of can't help looking at where I'm placed. Because my theory, if I were an editor, is you put the best story first and the second best story last, and you keep that up, third, then fourth, until the weaker stories are in the middle. That was the way I would do it. But then I looked at this and I realized that Gardner had these stories chronological from publication date going back to the 50s. And what you got as you read them was this long-term, there's a lot of stories and this long-term discussion of things like enhancements, immortality, higher IQs, all these things, as if one writer takes one view and then a couple of years later, here's somebody else, and that quality of a long-term discussion is one of the things that keeps science fiction alive. And I should tell you that where my story was, even though I was one of the oldest authors in the book, all the other authors who were older were in the front of the book, about where you'd expect them. But I was up among the last 4 or 5, and I take a great deal of pride. That my story had come out in 2000. It was right around 1999. Now that's when it came out, and it was up there with stories by writers who were a lot younger.
That's awesome. And yeah, I think it's, genre is really interesting because I agree with you that it's still looked down upon. In fact, I know because in owning a store that focuses on sci-fi and fantasy, I have people who walk in and say like, oh, this isn't a real bookstore, or like, oh, is this a bookstore for kids? Things like that. It's like, have you read any sci-fi or fantasy recently? Because like a lot of it is definitely not for kids. Like, so yeah, I just think it's interesting how like things change, but in a lot of ways they stay the same. Mm-hmm. Nerds are still nerds.
Yeah, the biggest change is one that took place with mysteries too, which is that the field is now dominated by the novel. And science fiction was basically a magazine genre from 1926 up to around 1950, and a lot of us still feel that the best forms for science fiction are the novelette and the novella, which are stories that are just long enough you've got time to introduce the background and so on without straining yourself, and yet you don't overdo things. Sometimes I've read science fiction stories, or I felt novels, or I felt the last 20% were mostly devoted to tidying up the plot, but all the interesting stuff that that besides the plot have been pretty much taken care of. And the one thing I would mention about science fiction is that it's the only field in which the shorter forms are still alive. The short story, the American commercial short. Okay, when I started writing, you wanted me to talk about that, right?
Yes, for sure.
Okay. Well, I started sending stories into magazines in 1950 when I was 14. And at that time, you had all kinds of markets for short stories. You had the big slick magazines like Saturday Evening Post and Collier's that came out every week and had 4 or 5 stories. And, all the way down to the pulp magazines, of course. And, plenty of markets. And the pulp magazines died in the 50s. Almost all of them, except the science fiction magazines. And by the 1960s, I would say the other magazines, the slicks, weren't really publishing much in short fiction. And I once did an experiment going into the local Barnes and Noble, if you don't mind, and in the science fiction section, I think I counted about 15 or 20 anthologies and collections. Whereas over in the mystery section, there was one, really. Well, there was one collection of Donald Westlake, which was sort of a fluke that he'd been asked to write some short stories for Playboy or something, so he did. And then there was the Best American Mysteries, which is part of that whole little series. And that was it. And I think that's true of most other fields. You simply do not see much, almost anything. But science fiction, and also it's true that writers who write novels will still occasionally write fiction. Or you'll get writers like my friend Michael Swanwick, who is constantly moving back and forth between them, And that definitely makes science fiction distinctive, I think, from other genres.
Yes, I think you're definitely correct because I sell a lot of novellas and anthologies, and I have a whole section for that now, because there's just so many of them. And Tor.com does like a whole catalog of just novellas. So I think that yes, the sort of the short form has seen a revolution, especially in science fiction.
Now, with the novellas, they bring those out as physical books?
Yes.
Oh, I hadn't seen those. I knew they were doing that as ebooks.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah, physical books, short,
Yeah.
100 to maybe 200 at most pages. I think it's most of them are less than 200 pages.
Mhm.
And yeah, they make like hardcover books, paperback books out of them. And typically they're around $20 and you can buy.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's funny that you talk. I Want the Stars is only 140 pages.
I know, right? Which would be considered a novella today.
That's right.
Is it? I mean, I would call that a short novel. Novella is like 70 pages, 80 pages.
Well, the rule, when they give out the Nebulas of the Hugos, they say 45,000 words.
Which I think I Want the Stars is just over or just around.
It's right around 50,000 words. Yeah.
So yeah, it's a little longer than what a novella is, for sure. Because I think you're right that it's 40,000 words is like the max for a novella.
Well, what happened was that it turns out that the two books together in an ace double were supposed to be 90,000 words total, and I had to shorten I Want the Stars by 15%. I think the contract called for 55, so I had to get it. I forget what it was. Anyway, so I found out later from my friend Terry Carr, he and Donald Wollheim was the main editor, and Terry had become the associate editor. Anyway, Terry said that Don had, for some reason, ordered two 50,000 word books for the same ace double. And since the guy on the other side was Kenneth Bullner, who was a much better known writer, I guess that's why I was the one who had to cut mine.
And you've written, I think, most of these formats, right, Tom? And so what is your favorite format to write in?
Oh, well, actually, my career went through two stages, and the second stage has been starting back around 1989, when I've been strictly a magazine writer. I really decided that that was where I should concentrate. And most of my stories appeared in Asimov, and most of the time I've written in the novelette length, which I find suits me just perfectly. And there are different ways to define these in length. I always think of a novelette as being about 10 to 15,000 words, which is, if you're not used to thinking that way, you figure four double-spaced typewritten pages to 1,000 words is a good way to do that. But the official lengths, because of the awards systems, a novelette is 7,200 words up to 14,999. No, wait, I'm sorry, 17,999. That's right. I think that's right. Yeah, it's basically that. It's somewhere around 17 is a top length for now, and then you get into the. But I always think of them more restrictedly, that the novelettes around 10 to 15, and classically the magazine novella was around 20 to 25,000 words.
And magazines don't publish those anymore. Almost every magazine tops out at 5,000 in terms of what they want to see.
Yeah.
I don't know. First, I'm mostly familiar with Asimov. To me, the three print magazines at this point are Asimov's Analog and Fantasy and Science Fiction. And Asimov prints a lot of novelettes. And they're now bi-monthly. And so there's usually in the bi-monthly issue several novelettes and one novella at least, and then several short stories. And the short stories run up to 7,200 words. And for some reason, for the last three or four things I've written for him have been short stories. So maybe my mind is changing again. I don't know.
I have a question, if it's okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. Go ahead.
One of the things that has just blown me away about Tom's work is the 60s were, compared to today, a very regressive time, particularly when it came to sexual identity and preference and expressing that. And in I Want the Stars, you've got some very progressive sexual identities and relationships. And just this year, 1965, Tom had written a story for Galaxy, which was one of the first mature discussions of I guess it's polygamy, but it's really a 5-man, 5-woman marriage.
No, it's a bit. So it was, it was 4 men and 4 women.
Well, it was 4 men, 4 women with room for another pair.
Well,
and that was
because somebody had left. Oh well, I forget. You just read it. No,
one of the partners had died.
Yeah.
And so they were recruiting for the next husband.
Yeah.
And it was just a fascinating book. I'd never read anything like it. So I guess my question is, what made you think to incorporate what we would call today queer issues in your writing at a time when almost no one was doing it?
Well, actually, it was group marriage. It was not necessarily homosexual. I mean, it was that wasn't the issue.
But you have written homosexual pairings. There were 2 canonical lesbians and I Want the Stars, and there was certainly the suggestion that no one would have looked askance at a same-sex relationship.
Yeah, right. Well, those things, it seems to me, have always. The future is going to be different from the present, and the long-term trend in American life, and I think that is true, has been to constantly bring new groups into what is considered the normal, I don't know what the term you call it is, but into the society. And to me, that's just a long-term trend. And a lot of other writers have done that too. Fred Pohl did that very well in some of his books. And okay, there's one other thing, all right, which might be worth mentioning. One thing you want to do in science fiction is give your readers the feeling that they have stepped into a world which really is different from the present, and it's different in a lot of ways, not just one. And I think that's one of the ways in which you do it, that you bring in these other possibilities and like something that is taken for granted or is just part of the society. And but of course, in doing that, you're saying, well, the future is going to be different, more accepting, and so on. But it's also a way of just making it clear to people that this is the future, Like in a lot of cases, one other thing I always did from the start was to have women in roles that they wouldn't normally be found in because that, again, that's the future to me. That was the future quite clearly. Does that answer the question? Or?
I think it does. And I similarly, I was wondering the same thing about, you have a main, a character that is a person of color, and it's sort of what, we didn't see a lot of that back then either. So similarly, I was wondering why you chose to do that, to feature a person of color in your work as well.
Well, again, you're writing about the future, and that's the way I assumed the future would be, especially in a world the skin color would be just a superficial characteristic. That was basically the idea, that was the world that we certainly wanted. I should mention that when I wrote this, when I was working on this, the Sample Chavez outline, I went on the March on Washington, the one on August 28th, 1963. So definitely all those issues were alive at that time. And it just seemed natural that was something that you would do. In fact, I'd actually done it earlier. It's just Gideon is aware, I had a story called The Green Beret in the January 1961 issue of Analog. And again, I had a Black American who was It's about a UN force operating in Africa, but the force itself is multinational. Different people. It's a sort of a professional UN army, and the hero is a Black American. A young guy, and I was in the army when I wrote it, surrounded by young guys. Some of them, anyway, they're always around who, still had dreams of being soldiers. Some of them, and so that's what the story is about. Is this guy's development as a soldier, and it just seemed to me like, why shouldn't we have a Black guy? You can look around and see, well, they're not doing that. There is a problem, however, with science fiction and written fiction, and that is if you're writing about futures in which it doesn't really matter that much to people what color you are, why do you mention it? If you're doing this on Star Trek or in the movies, very simple. Denzel Washington appears as the president of the United States, and you've made the point. Nobody has to say a word. But at least in a story, you have to mention it. So that makes it a little trickier. But, and the story, by the way, sold to John Campbell in 3 days. So that was not an issue with him either, as far as I could tell. And
I just think it's cool that you were doing this stuff in the 60s,
Well, in a way, it was part of the zeitgeist of the time. There were a lot of people I know, and one of my closest friends at that point, I met my wife in a coffee house, which is actually only about located only about 2 blocks from where I'm sitting right now, here in Center City, Philadelphia. And I started hanging around the coffee house, and it was people associate the late 50s, this was, coffee houses with beatniks and all that. But basically, we had a lot of young people living downtown in Philly like me. And it was, we needed hangouts. And so the people you met there were not necessarily beatniks. And one of my best friends for many years, until he died recently, was Black, and I met there. And Greg was then working on a master's in physics. He'd been to Lincoln University, and then he was working on a master's in physics. But then, like a lot of people who were studying physics, he realized that he might be okay as a physicist, but there was this new field coming along called computer programming, in which there were really big opportunities. And so he switched, and in fact, he actually for a while was one of the organizers of the first all-Black computer consulting firm in the United States. And they did things like the Manhattan, I think they did the Manhattan phone book or something, stuff like that. And this was natural. It did not, this was the way the world was moving. And Greg went to the March on Washington with another group. I think he might have been a Quaker group. And I went with my wife's president. I went with the ACLU. That's right. I went with the ACLU. And at the time, it just seemed that was the way the world, it all seemed pretty natural. That's all I can tell you. In the milieu I was living in, it all seemed pretty natural and the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering, you talked about all these people too, and I know that like you've known so many people. So I'm really interested in if you have any interesting stories about people like Del Rey or Delaney or these people that you knew, because it's so cool that you ran in these circles with these folks.
Yeah, right. Well, now you put me on the spot. So I do know that Chip and I Chip actually lives here in Philly in Center City. He lives probably about a mile from where I am right now. Yeah, he's moved on the Parkway. And we've had this running joke that we would do a panel together, but we couldn't figure out who was supposed to stand on his head, to do an ace book panel. One of us would have to stand on his head. Well, I could tell you all, when I wrote the Tree Lord of Ematerin, it had no, I won't tell you that story. There is a story I tell you about Don Wollheim And Isaac Asimov once at some kind of a party, I think it was at PhilCon. Isaac, you never knew what Isaac was going to say, you know. And he said to me, "You know, Tom, you look like a handsome Don Wollheim." So I went over to Don Wollheim, and I told him what Isaac had said, and then we spent a couple of minutes trying to figure out which one of us had been insulted. Isaac, he just said things,
and we do have a question from the audience that I think is actually a really good question. So Christine is asking, what was the reception of the inclusion of these queer themes and racial representation? Did you encounter pushback while attempting to publish any of these stories because you included those things?
No, I can just tell you no. I wrote this story. I wrote, the way it worked was, I came up with the sample chapter and outline for I Want the Stars, and I sent it off to the agency, Scott Meredith. And Terry Carr, who later worked at Ace Books, was at that time working with Scott Meredith, and he was handling my stuff. And I sent it to him, and within about 2 weeks or less, which was pretty nice, a nice turnaround, I got a note saying that he liked the book, and he'd be sending it out. And what happened next was kind of nice, because I have to tell you, when I sold my first story, I really found that it was an unshareable experience. The reason is some people will get all excited, "Oh, you're a published author," and just... And other people will wonder what's the excitement. It's this crummy magazine they never heard before, and you're getting paid $32 or something, or $35. Why's that? Because most people really don't understand about beginners markets and how you advance as a writer and all that kind of stuff. So what was a big milestone in my life, I really couldn't share. I found it hard to share with. I just couldn't. But then when they sold I Want the Stars, my wife, of course, we were married about 2 years. And when I went on the March on Washington, we were all asked to pledge to do something, for the cause. And so the minister at Sarah's church, which was she was a Presbyterian, was a Southern liberal, which is the kind of person I've always liked. He'd grown up in South Carolina, and very practical man. And he set up a tutoring program at the church, and for which would be mostly in the way the school system, or that meant the students would be black students, and it was a very sensible thing to do. It was a reading program targeted at the 3rd and 7th grades, I think, because they're critical. Well, in order to prepare for this, for the materials they're going to use, once this Saturday, I had to go to a meeting where we had some training. And then I came back to our apartment, and I opened the door, and we had this cedar chest that I could just see from the door. And there was this manila envelope, and then this long legal length paper thing, like clearly a contract, and one of Scott Meredith's little note papers that they wrote on, which were very distinctive. And I looked at my wife. My wife saw me coming in. She had this big smile. And I said, "Don bought the book." And she said, "Yeah." And I had somebody I could share it with, because she understood exactly what this meant. Exactly. And,
that makes me kind of sad that you couldn't share your news with people.
That's right. Yeah, well, it is very hard, Well, I try funny. Sometimes I'll tell people that I've sold a story to Oswald. They always say congratulations, for a lot of people. And I always find this a little irritating. And I mentioned it to a friend of mine who's a science writer, does a lot of science writing, and he's written 2 or 3 books. And I said, "Do you feel a little, when people say congratulations, does that bother you?" And he said, "Yes, this is what I do." So all you want to say is, "Hey, I sold a story." And they say, "Oh, that's nice, or good, or something." This is what you do. It's like a lawyer, doctor saying, well, you know, I operated on somebody and they didn't die. Well, congratulations.
Or me saying like, oh, I sold a book today.
Well, at some point, this becomes what you do. And it's very satisfying, but, you know, you don't get all hysterical about it, you know.
Sure.
In fact, I tend to feel relieved most of the time. Gee, I went and put on all that work, and I said something's actually going to come of it.
Sure. And I do want to talk about, we have, you know, maybe 5 or 6 more minutes, but I do want to talk about your writing process a little bit as well, because I'm just curious for I Want the Stars, right? I know you wrote this in 1963. You're still writing now. What is your process, and how has it changed over the years? Do you outline? Do you not outline? How do you write now?
Yeah. For a long time, I outlined, and I didn't start a first draft until I knew exactly where I was going to go and how it was going to end, because I'm such a slow writer. I hated the thought that I might spend a lot of time writing something and then not be able to figure out how to end it. Lately, I've gotten to where even if I'm not quite sure what the ending's going to be, I'll start it because I figure I'll probably get the idea. If something will come, I'm pretty confident. I may as well be writing the story while I'm waiting for that instead of waiting around for it to come. My process, the first thing is that you got to know what a story is. And a lot of people don't have a story. To me means you have some interesting conflict or problem that could arise in the future. If there's a conflict, if there's no conflict or problem, you don't have a story. And it should be created by some development that could arise in the future. And that is where you have to start. Or at least you can't proceed until you get that. And that's the thing is very important to me. There comes a moment when the idea comes along and I say, boy, that will make a great story. That's when you catch fire, you know. It isn't like I have a great message or I'm going to make a great statement. This is going to make a great story. This is really worth working at. And that used to come when the idea would first float into my head. Now I have to work more to get ideas, but I take some subject nowadays that I think looks interesting, and what I do is I start writing notes. That way I know I'm doing something and not just standing around staring. So I make sure I've written a few hundred words or more of notes a day or something on the thing. And I just ramble around sometimes as it comes to me. Do a bit of character here, some background here, see some. And gradually, at some point, if I do this, something falls into place and I start thinking this is going to be a great story. And that's when I just keep plunging along and usually I come up with what I hope is a satisfactory ending. And at least I've been writing things that Sheila Williams and Asimov buy, so I guess they're okay. And the big point is there's a saying by Pasteur: chance favors the prepared mind. And one part of being prepared is knowing what a story is, what it is you're trying to do. And the other part is to just keep learning and gathering ideas, talking to people, listening to people. If you do all that and you know what a story is supposed to be, you've got some idea you're trying to do, and you work, and you're lucky, you come up with things.
Sure. And what advice would you give to like new writers who are looking to sort of break into this? Do you have any sage words for them?
I have no sage advice to them on how to break into writing today, because the situation is very different from what it was 50 years ago, believe me. Except that Fred Pohl once said that he had 2 questions people ask writers, and he gave the answers. The answers were, how do you learn to write? By writing. How do you sell your work? You put it in envelopes and send it to editors. And that's still largely true. You have to write and you have to submit. And nowadays, you're more likely to have to write whole novels and submit them to agents, but the principle's still the same. Other than that, my advice to young writers is always financial. And that is that they should learn how to save, how to invest, and how to build up some kind of a secondary income for themselves. If you have a job, don't spend all the money you make writing. Save it, invest it, learn how to invest, learn how to make your money work for you. That is, every writer needs some kind of or most writers need something to subsidize their writing. And I gave a talk at the Science Fiction Society about a year ago on the relationship between artists, some thoughts on the relationship between artists and the world, the normal world. And one of my points is the big question facing everybody in the arts is, how do you survive in reasonable comfort and still do the kind of work you want to do? And there's a lot you have to learn about that art, including the business side of writing and so on. But learning how to, don't be a big consumer, don't feel you got to borrow and buy and your life is not going to be, you don't judge your life by your possessions. You judge it by your achievements. That's what you want, and that's what you got to focus on.
Which is to say, if you're a writer, you're going to be poor.
Right.
No, you don't have to be poor, but you can be comfortable, and one advantage is that it doesn't take as much of material possessions to keep you happy. I spend a lot of my time I'm living in a nice apartment in the center of a big city, and when we don't have to deal with the virus, of course, I spend my major entertainments or things like I go to chamber music concerts and things like that, and which are not expensive, and I also do some reviewing, so that eases that, and I hang around with people, and if you're interested in life as art and socializing and learning, you can live a very nice, pleasant life without having a lot of money.
I think that's true. And
you're probably doing that too, right?
Oh yeah, as a bookseller, I don't make any money.
You have a nice life, right?
I have a very nice life. I tell people that all the time. Like, you don't get into the book business in any way, right? As a writer, as a publisher, as a bookseller, like all the way across the board, you don't get into this to get rich. The ones who do, it's like you hit the jackpot, you get lucky. But for the most part, all of us are just here doing it because we love to do it, right? And so, you can definitely be comfortable. I love being in the bookstore because I can talk to people about stuff. I can sort of make it a community center. So, I love my work, which is a good thing. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I don't need tons and tons. I mean, I need enough to live, but yes, I definitely agree that you can have a comfortable life without throwing money everywhere, for sure.
That's right.
Well, I want to show folks the cover of the reissued book, I Want the Stars. This is what it looks like, and I'm sorry, Gideon, I just totally covered you up, but this is the new cover of the book, which I think is pretty cool. How did this come about, Gideon?
This is the cover I wanted. I mean, it was pretty simple as that. I wanted to make sure that we had a person of color on the cover, and I'm a firm believer that you can judge a book by its cover. And I remember talking to a distributor about that. He says people will judge you by your cover because if your cover is good, they will assume that you've kept the rest of the components good. And we have a ridiculously amazing cover composer named Sabrina Watts. But with this case, I cast about the internet looking for good models, and I wanted one with that sort of defiant but wistful look, and it was exactly what I wanted. So I just put together an ugly mock-up, and then she took it and made it great. And then I just love that cover. It's definitely different from covers these days. Our covers tend to be very sort of eye-catching, and they always have people, because I like people. And if there's any main reason why our covers don't look like everyone else's, it's because I actually don't have a good thumb on what modern covers look like, because I read science fiction from 55 years ago. And I actually think our fresh perspective has helped us. But anyway, I really like that cover. I think it fits the book. If anything, Janorden looks a little young, but but on the other hand, I don't know. I actually don't know how old the model is. The thing is, he could be any age from 20 to 50. And he was mostly bald. We gave him the silver hair that Janorden has. And also, in the future, Janorden is in his 40s or 50s, but he looks like he's in his 20s or 30s, because it's the future, and utopias do that.
Yeah,
So
right. I imagine that people would continue through several centuries, looking sort of indeterminately somewhere between 20 and 50.
Right. I mean, I'm 83, and I think I keep it together pretty well.
You're not 83. You're not, I know what 83 is like, because I was 83 last year. So you're not 83.
I always joke that I'm an 800-year-old swamp witch, because no one can ever guess my age. And so I let some people guess like way older. Like I've had people be like, "Oh, are you like 50?" Like, no. And then some people guess like way younger. And so it's like no one ever guesses my age correctly. So I always joke, I'm like, "Oh, I'm just an 800-year-old swamp witch that's just perpetually living immortally."
I tell them I'm 17 permanently.
Absolutely. Well, for sure, you can, of course, buy this book from Tubby and Coos. That is why we're all here. Hopefully, you will buy books. And so you can go to our website, tubbyandcoos.com, and just click place an order. It's right there. It's very easy to do. And Tom's book is there. You just click on it. Again,
and they're signed.
A couple of clicks.
And they're signed too, right? You have the book plates.
Yes.
I haven't gotten them yet, I don't think.
What? I sent them ages ago.
Okay, maybe I'll have to look, but I'll have to go back and look. I'm not sure.
Because if you want them signed, we have the ability to make them signed.
We do. And I am supposed to have book plates. I will check, Gideon, to make sure. I don't remember ever seeing them, but if I don't have them, I'll let you know, because something may have happened. The mail has been really weird with the freeze and like all this kind of stuff going on, so it's very possible that it like got held up and things or something, but we will have it if we don't. So yes, it's something that you can't get in other on Amazon, at least. So definitely purchase from us, and you can get a signed copy. And I'm really excited that you were able to do this with us, Tom. Thank you so much for coming and talking with me. I could listen to you talk like all night. This is so interesting.
I'm always afraid I'm talking too much, but I really enjoyed doing this. This has been very nice. I really enjoyed meeting you too, Candace.
Thank you.
You've told me some important things about science fiction in bookstores that I will tell people.
Amazing. Yes, and just to let everyone know, before we came live, Tom and I were having a discussion about science fiction versus fantasy, and how readers of sci-fi and fantasy are different kinds of readers, and a lot of people want to lump it all together. And I mentioned that when I make a determination, for me, Star Wars is fantasy and Star Trek is science fiction. And that's a very contentious opinion to have, but Tom agreed with me, so that made me happy. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Gideon. And thank you, everyone who is watching. Now or later, this will live on our YouTube channel. So thanks to everyone who is watching and buying books. And as always, thanks to all of our customers, and we will see everyone on our next broadcast. We have a bunch more coming up this month, so check out our events calendar online to see who we have. And again, thank you, Gideon and Tom.
Thank you.